Here comes Richard.
Okay. We are about to start the program here. We have a couple more people coming in.
Hello, Richard.
Can you?
Okay, I'll scoot over.
Yeah.
And here comes Anna.
You did.
That's okay. Hey, good evening and welcome to our presentation. Our organization is Rural Leavenworth Incorporated. We are a nonpartisan organization that keeps rural Leavenworth County residents informed about local events, educates the public about government actions that may affect rural Leavenworth County residents, provides a voice for private property rights and individual liberties with rural Leavenworth County residents. And in the case of our presenter tonight, environmental use of property. Okay, Dr. Baum, first of all, welcome. Dr. Baum is Director of Monarch Watch, Senior Scientist for the Kansas Biological Survey. She has her PhD from Texas A&M and has worked with pollinators. Has worked with pollinators for the last 25 years, I presume, primarily in the Southern Plains as opposed to the Midwest.
Primarily.
Okay. I like Vitex, by the way. I don't know if you're going to talk about that tonight. For Monarch research focus on the effects of land use, monarchs, milkweeds, monarch parasite interactions, which I know nothing about. She also serves on numerous conservation efforts for monarchs and other pollinators. Last thing, do you want questions impromptu or do you want to wait till the end?
Well, I think we have a good sized group that we can,
Okay.
as we go. So
Super.
if something
Thank you.
comes up, just let me know. So where's a good spot to?
Right there is
Right there?
good.
Okay.
And I am going to share it online as well.
Okay. So I was going to start by just talking about, who pollinates, who are the pollinators? And of course, there's endless options. And if you get down into the, scientific process, it's, whatever organism can transfer pollen between plants. But if you look at very general terms, there's lots of different insects that are good pollinators. The best pollinators we think about as being bees. And so I'll talk a good bit about bees. Butterflies don't tend to be that good of a pollinator, but I'm going to talk about butterflies because that's the other thing I do. But there's, beetles and flies and bats and birds and, small mammals. There's just tons of different animals that can be pollinators in certain contexts. And so a lot of times people want to know, who pollinates what, which is not necessarily an easy question to ask. So there's kind of these generalities that have been developed over time, but there's exceptions and different rules. But so some of the typical ones you might think about, for hummingbird pollinated plants, you typically think of them as being red and tubular, having a large amount of nectar with a pretty high concentration. When you think about bees, you think more of yellow, blue, white flowers, lower sugar concentrations, but there's lots of variability in terms of what actually happens out there. And so lots of different options, but you do tend to have, certain plants that are going to attract certain types of pollinators. And then, of course, lots of plants that attract a wide range or wide diversity of different pollinators. So I'm going to focus on butterflies and bees, since that's what I know best. So there's lots of overlap in terms of what butterflies and bees need. They both need nectar. They both need shelter sites. Butterflies will also need host plants. So, when we think about monarchs, they need the milkweed as their host plant that they're going to lay eggs on for the caterpillars to develop on. And we also think about overwintering sites for both butterflies and bees. For butterflies, they're pretty interesting. They do everything in terms of overwintering. So there's some that overwinter as eggs, some as first instars, which are the smallest size caterpillar when they first hatch out of the egg. Others will overwinter in the chrysalis or as adults, or ones will migrate, as we think about for monarchs. And then for native bees, they're also going to use pollen. So in addition to the nectar, they're going to use pollen. And then they'll need nest sites. And I've got some slides coming up, but a large majority of our bees are going to be ground nesting bees. So I think about 70%. And most of those are going to be solitary. So they're gonna, create individual nests in the ground. And then the other 30%, we usually think about being twig or wood nesting. And then of course there's, cavity nesters, which get more attention. That would be what we put honeybees in that category, and lots of other things. And so when we think about the twig nesting bees, they're going to need sometimes the pithy plant stems. Some of our really good nectar plants are also have good stems that the bees will nest in. So they won't nest in them the first year when they're green, but if you leave your stems, over winter, then they'll be in good condition for the next year for them to create nest in. So you kind of have to leave them for 2 winters for them to make it all the way through. So I threw this in. So this is all honeybees. So honeybees are not native to North America. They were brought over in the mid 1600s by the early settlers. So they've been around for a long time, and they've come to play a really important role in agriculture. In some cases, some of our crops, native bees are going to be effective pollinators, especially kind of the smaller scale, more specialty crops. But when we get to kind of our large monoculture crops, they're going to rely a lot more on honeybees. So you can make almonds in California, other types of crops. And of course, we have some, like if you think about tomatoes and eggplants that require that vibration, where they require like bumblebees to provide certain types of pollination services. But you can kind of see with the honeybees here where they're collecting, where the pollen is hitting them. So, here, the poppy mallow, the honeybees getting lots of pollen on its head. So that's where it's going to be transferring the pollen to the next plant. This is canola. I did a lot of research in Oklahoma on bees in canola, and actually a lot of the honey producers in the Midwest would move their bees from almonds in California to canola in Oklahoma to try to build the colonies up after they had made the long distance trip to California. And there also, you can see as well, but the pollen's going to be on the head. And then of course the honeybees will groom themselves and pack the pollen on their legs. And then the last plant over here is milkweed. That's green antelope horn milkweed, which we have a lot of in Oklahoma, and we have in Kansas as well. But for that, you can't see it very well, but they've got all these little projections on their legs. So they don't actually collect the pollen of the milkweed. Milkweed has a pollinia, so it's this kind of weird structure where it's got pollen packets, so the bees can't pack it into their clavicular pollen loads or anything. But and the honeybees actually kind of get stuck on the milkweed plant sometimes because the pollinia will be kind of holding them in, and they're trying to get off of the plant. So it's kind of interesting, but it's a great nectar source. So they'll use some plants for both pollen and nectar, and then others just for nectar or just for pollen. So it varies a lot. And then just some examples of where bees will collect pollen at. So the corbicula pollen load, that's on their legs, and they'll typically have kind of a smooth, shiny surface, and there'll be hairs that curl around it so they can pack the pollen onto their legs really well. So you can see the pollen load there. Others, like the leafcutter bees, collect pollen. They have lots of hairs on their abdomen, so you can see all the pollen on the abdomen there. And then we can think about butterflies. We've got a skipper here, and you can see there's not really a good way for them to collect lots of pollen. So you can see why they're not as effective as moving pollen, and they're not going to feed on pollen. There is one exception, heliconius butterflies. I think the zebra longwings will occasionally make it as a stray to Kansas, but they actually kind of collect pollen on their proboscis, their straw-like structure that they use for nectar, and they'll kind of liquefy it and then consume it. But for the most part, they're not intentionally collecting pollen. Switching back to native bees, we've got about 4,000 native bee species in the U.S. They range in size from very small, almost gnat-like looking bees to our large carpenter bees, and some of the bumblebees would be larger as well. And everybody kind of wants to know, like, how many would you find in an area? So a lot of my research, I spent a lot of time at the Stillwater Research Range in Oklahoma. So, kind of pasture size sites. If you go out there for a few years, over most of the growing season, you'll end up with, 100 or so species. And I think that's similar from when I've talked to people at KU for the bee community here. So there's lots of bees out there. Some might be active only early in the year, some later in the year, some throughout the entire year. When you're surveying bees, some they might just show up in the afternoon. They don't come out until later. So there's lots of variability in terms of what they do when they're out. This was just looking at the different nest sites for native bees. Again, 70% of them are going to be the ground nesters. 30% would be the stem or wood nesters. They'll sometimes collect other nesting material. So again, leaf cutter bees would be a good example where they're going to collect pieces of leaf to add to their nest. Here would be an example. You can't see it very well. I think I condensed the PDF down too, so it's not the greatest picture. But where they'll nest in the ground, and sometimes you might find a aggregation of nest of soil nesting bees, but it doesn't mean that they're it's a concerted effort. It's still individual bees. It's just a good site in terms of drainage. So you kind of think of sites with good drainage and some bare ground. You need access to bare ground for those nest sites. And then that picture on the top there, there's other interesting things bees do. That those flowers were in a planter on the OSU campus. But some of the longhorn bees, the males will just kind of sleep somewhere overnight. So they're kind of hanging on with their mandibles onto the flowers. So interesting things so kind of different resources that bees need. And then we do have 3 bumblebee species that are petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act. The one that's pictured is the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus. In Oklahoma, it's our most common bee. I think it's pretty common in Kansas as well. But when you move farther north and east, there's very low populations. Yeah, this is actually in my front yard in Oklahoma. On blue sage, Salvia azurea, one of my favorites. And then also Bombus fraternus is being considered for listing. We would encounter that one relatively commonly at the rangeland sites. And then Bombus variabilis, that's a cuckoo bee. So it nests in the nest of other bees. And in this case, the American bumblebee, so the first one on the list. So the decline of the American bumblebee would likely have contributed to the decline of the parasite. And it was the last collected specimen was in 1990 in Kansas, which is more recent than what we had in Oklahoma, at least. And then thinking about what plants are important for the stem nesting bees. That's a question I've gotten a lot, and it's really hard to kind of dig that out of the literature. So I kind of took good plant stems and intersected that with good monarch nectar plants to come up with a list that kind of meets multiple needs, right? So a lot of these you'll recognize as good nectar plants for monarchs. So Pinstamen, Monarda, Eupatorium, Echinacea, Solidago, so all of these are good nectar plants, but they've also got nice thick plant stems that the native bees will nest in as well. And then this is from the research range in Stillwater as well. So just thinking about what that native bee community, what that looks like over the year. So these are the plants we collected the bees from. So it gives you an idea of, when you think about pollinators, you need to have plants that bloom throughout the growing season. So this gives you an idea of kind of what that looks like. So the very first plant on the list is green antelope horn milkweed. So it was the most used nectar plant by bees, one throughout the whole year, if you sum it across the whole year, but then in particular in May and June. So it's a great nectar source, in addition to being a good host plant for monarchs. But you can see, species that bloom at different times are going to be more or less important. So when you think about providing resources for pollinators, trying to make sure you're finding good plants across that whole growing season is important. And I just threw this in, because it's interesting. So nectar, so when you think about nectar, you can sample flowers for nectar. The wild Petunia aurelia, that's a little slender glass tube. And if it were to be completely full, it would hold 1 microliter. So 1 drop of liquid has 50 microliters in it, just to put that in context. And so you can, suck the nectar out of the flower, and then they have these special sugar refractometers that are adapted for small sample sizes. So you have to have ones that'll work with that little tiny, small amount. And you can measure the sugar concentration. So if you went and measured the milkweed flowers, they would end up with 0.2 microliters. So that's like a fraction of your little tiny tube. But 41% sucrose, that's pretty sweet. The diamond flowers, they were extremely small. You have to add water of a known quantity to get enough to be able to get a sugar reading. And then convert that, factor in the amount of water. And then the wild petunia, 2 microliters. So lots more nectar, and that's one, 2 flower, the bees tend to crawl down the corolla. And 21% sucrose. So you can kind of think about, I think the estimates for, how much it takes to make a pound of honey, what is it, 2 million flowers and 50,000 kilometers. So you can see kind of why that takes a lot to add up, depending on what plant you're looking at. And we just earlier, before I started, we're talking about Lenora, who's master gardener down in Peoria, and that she's got this great Kansas native caterpillar food plant list that you can find on the Kansas State Extension Master Gardener site. And so you can kind of look through that and see all the different host plants. And I just picked a few that I had pictures of. But some host plants are going to be good nectar plants and good pollen plants. Others, you mainly think about just having that host plant purpose. So lots of different options. I've got passion vine, and I've got a Gulf fritillary picture because we had a lot of those in Oklahoma. I think you get more of the variegated fritillaries here in Kansas. Buckeyes, we've had lots of buckeyes moving through this year. They're migratory as well. So are the Gulf fritillaries. There's a black swallowtail and pearl crescent as well. And then we think about butterflies. In addition to the host plants, they also need a place to roost. This happened to be in my front yard, and I will say in Oklahoma, when I moved in, I had 4 Bradford pears. I was down to 1 because I cut them down, I think one of them might fall in, but and you might as well get rid of them before they fall, not to mention, they need to be gone. But that happened to be, the cloud stuff happened to be on the Bradford pear, but look at needing a place to root. So it's kind of interesting. You can find them on different vegetation, but yeah, poor choice of tree. And then butterflies also need nutrients. So a lot of times you'll see them around mud puddles. So it's called mud puddling. The little yellows, there's a couple of Mexican yellows there. They're collecting nutrients from the dirt, the ground as well. So some interesting behavior that you might find to see as well. And I mentioned a couple examples for overwintering, but again, butterflies do it all in terms of how they overwinter. There's quite a few other butterflies in addition to monarchs that migrate. So painted ladies would be one of those. Buckeyes, red admirals. We've seen a lot coming through. It's been a good year for our migratory butterflies. The eastern tail blues will overwinter as late instars. The giant swallowtails will overwinter in their chrysalis. There's a lot that overwinter as adults, question marks and commas and other ones. First instars, I always think of regal fritillaries and Diana fritillaries. And so lots of options for how they overwinter. But shifting a little bit to monarchs, they're very unique in terms of their long distance migration. They make the longest distance migration for any of our butterflies. So certainly, if you think about the distance from southern Canada to central Mexico, and then varying distances along the way. This is the overwintering graph for the most recent year. So this is 23, 24 over here. And I've got a picture next, and we'll go back to the graph in a minute. But what they'll do is they'll go to the overwintering sanctuaries where they've recorded monarchs for years. They'll find the tree with monarchs that's kind of the farthest upslope, and then they'll measure the distance from that tree to all the trees around the periphery of the colony. And the colonies aren't particularly static, right? So they tend to be the most concentrated when they're taking these measurements, but they'll kind of move or shift. They'll look for water sources when it warms up and things. So it's very interesting, but you can see, it's not very straightforward how many monarchs there are in a hectare because there's just tons and tons on the trees. But they've done research, and the most recent, they tried to look across all these studies that had tried to estimate, how many monarchs are there per a hectare, and they came up with this 21.1 million as our most recent best estimate. But if we go back up to our graph, we can see it was really low this year. This was the second lowest year on record. And it was odd from many perspectives in terms of where the monarchs were located. So very, very low year. Those numbers came out in February. I think we even were quoted as saying, you may not see many monarchs this year, but I will say that it's actually looking, so very few moved into Texas. It was very sparse. Numbers were really, really low, but it seemed to be a good year for the first generation. So the eggs that were laid, and they're insects. The strategy is you lay a bunch of eggs, and not many will make it. But if it's a good year and a lot make it, your population can increase, pretty quickly. So for monarchs, we say, I don't know, it's less than 10%, probably more like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5, maybe even sometimes lower, percent of eggs will make it from egg to adult. But when it's a good year, and Chip thinks because there were some freezes this year, that it might have killed off some of the predators. So the population seems to have done pretty good. And some of the other migratory butterflies, the buckeyes and the red admirals and the orange sulfurs that we've had moving up have seemed to have really good populations as well. So it's actually looking pretty good. So less sparse than what we were expecting when asked in February. So that is good news. And then I always like to mention for Monarch Watch, it's interesting kind of plotting what Chip has done over the years on the graph of the overwintering population size. So Monarch Watch was started in 1992, and the first effort was for tagging, right? So they wanted to tag monarchs and see what happened with the migration. So that was the original effort back in 1992. He pretty quickly added, a lot of educational components, with schools and life cycles and kind of that hands-on experience with monarchs. And then you can see we had some low years. So back in 2005, Chip started the Monarch Way Station program, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but I feel like he was ahead of the game for all things monarch related over the years. So identifying the need for more habitat, and so thinking about, how can we get people to put more monarch habitat on the ground. And then, we had a lot of low years here. So the petition to list monarchs was submitted in 2014. And this is the 2013-14 was the lowest population size on record. And that's when Monarch Watch started distributing native milkweed plants. So at the time, it was difficult to find native plants, much less native milkweed plants. So it just wasn't something that was very commonly grown. It's not, you got to go through the, process of cold moist stratification. There's constant pest issues with aphids and whatnot. Chip started working with several nurseries to grow out milkweed. We had volunteers that collect milkweed seeds, so we can collect seed from a particular region, grow out the plants, and send them back to where those seeds came from. So there's lots of efforts that have happened since then, and lots of. I feel like native plant availability has increased a lot, but early on, Chip was at the front of that. And then just looking at kind of some of the reasons we think the population size was so low this year. These are the drought monitor graphs. So looking at conditions at the end of last year during the migration. So there hasn't been a whole lot of attention given to nectar plants. You always just kind of assume, oh, they'll find something. So the focus has been on milkweed, but you can see, dark red means not good. Yellow and orange, also not good, but not quite as not good. And so essentially, it's just really not good looking graphs, right? And the challenge for the end of this past year was how far that drought extended. So some of the previous years where we've had droughts, it might be dry in Texas, but maybe once they get a little farther in Mexico, they can make up that nectar because conditions will be better. But this past year, it extended all the way down to very close to the overwintering sites. So thinking about, nectar and what that looks like is important as well. And then I threw this in here, kind of looking at, what areas do we have to create more habitat for monarchs and other pollinators. So this shows the protected areas in the US or the colored areas. So we've got a good bit in the West, but, we look east of the Rockies, there's not really anything, right? So it's really up to private land owners to figure out what they can do to help. And so I put this in here. Minnesota has a Lawns to Lagoons program, which is a little maybe misleading because I think most of what they have when you actually look at the program are these pocket habitats, which are really, you could just call them monarch way stations too, right? That are more general, but it's kind of a nice summary of, what are these different things you can do? What's the difficulty, the cost, kind of ways of looking at it. And it's actually interesting when you start looking more, trying to see where there's other lawn programs. And I will say in the southwestern US where there's, major water concerns, right? There's a focus on, what to do with lawns because of water issues. But then also, it's complicated, right? So, if you pull up your lawn and put in gravel, then you've got, you're also have the urban heat island issues because you're losing the vegetation. So figuring out, how to balance all that, it's really interesting. But if we think about it, we can think of their pocket of habitat, those are really, small gardens or way stations. And then I'll touch on these other ones, flowering trees and shrubs. I'll touch on the pollinator lawn and kind of compromises to that approach. And then meadows would be kind of a larger scale example, but I have some examples of that as well. So Monarch way stations, this shows the map at the end of last year. So I think we're at 47,000 something now. So we're hoping to hit 50,000 this year. And since I started in 2005, next year will be the 20-year anniversary. So that's exciting. And Monarch way station #1 is located, it would have been right where the plant sale was, if you walked the garden. And the Douglas County Master Gardeners maintain all that, so it's interesting. They come out usually Thursday mornings. It's a very large group of them. They divided up the garden in different, it's beautiful. There's an amazing number of different host plants. There's a number of caterpillars you can find out there, and any one of different, butterflies or moths. It's crazy. But there's a whole team that supports that. So I was trying to set my expectations for since I get to create my own new habitat at my home a little more realistic. So anyway, but it's wonderful. But we even have monarch way stations in other countries, including places that don't have monarchs. It's interesting. The concept and the idea has really taken off, and there's lots of interest in that. So this is kind of the abbreviated, shortened version of what way stations look like. So really any size will work, but typically 100 square feet or more is ideal. Most good pollinator plants are gonna require sun, so at least having a good bit of sun. Good drainage, having, some good plant density, so thinking about shelter, but not too crowded, so kind of a balance there. Not too sparse, but not too crowded. For milkweed plants, the recommendation is 10 or more plants. Ideally, you would have 2 species. That's more important in some areas than others. But the idea would be, if one species not doing well for whatever, conditions that year, that the other one would be. But the 10 plants is because, once you get those late instars, the 5th instar caterpillars, they eat a lot. And so you want to make sure you've got enough food to get enough caterpillars all the way through. Nectar plants, that graph I showed for native bees would be a good example. You want stuff blooming throughout the growing season, making sure you've got, several options, annuals, perennials, a variety of different options out there. And then, various recommendations, to avoid using insecticides, to keep invasive species out, doing other things that you can do as needed. And I usually like to highlight how you can support other pollinators, in that habitat. So again, if we think about the native bees and the overlap between the good pithy stemmed plants and monarch host plants.
Kansas Forest, oddly enough, has a eastern pollinator bundle and a western pollinator bundle, and they have things that aren't trees, like choke cherries. All of them choke cherries. My grandmother used to make jelly out of them. Do you have any input in terms of, I know it's KSU, not KU, but do you have any input, or have you thought of providing input to the Kansas Forest in terms of the seed packages or the seedling packages they carry?
And I have looked at that because I feel like, a lot of the focus for pollinators has been forbs, so our wildflowers, but certainly shrubs and trees make a big difference. And it's interesting too, thinking about emerald ash borer, and, I had an ash tree in the home I moved into in Florence that was cut down before I moved in because it had emerald ash borer. So think about like, what are opportunities then for replacing those trees, with diversity that's going to contribute in different ways, whether it's a nectar source, it's a host plant. I haven't decided what to put there yet. There's lots of options. But I've got a little bit about trees, coming up. But yeah, it is interesting. I feel like there's lots of opportunities that one could take advantage of, that maybe has not been a large focus on the pollinator side of things. And I have reached out to quite a few different people, but anyway, you reach out and you kind of go down these various paths, and then other things come up. But I think there are opportunities to think about how to connect, and I feel like with monarchs and other pollinators, you can connect to pretty much anything anybody's interested in doing, right? So if they're interested in providing quail habitat, or they're interested in water conservation, or they're interested in soil retention, there's ways to connect to all of those things and add in the pollinator piece. So I feel like that's one thing. We talk about monarchs a lot, but most of what we do for monarchs is really good for other pollinators as well. So I feel like there's the opportunity to make sure that we're adding in the pollinator part, the monarch part, to all of those conversations, because it's relatively easy. It's an easy fit, right? So in some cases, it might be just shifting a little something to what one does to include pollinators. And it's usually fits with all of the other goals as well. So definitely something I think that would work. And trees are an interesting challenge. I'm not sure if they're coming up super soon here. Oh, they are. You forget what you put where when you give a presentation. And I will say a lot of the poster-like graphics that I put in here are from Pollinator Partnership. We collaborate with them, but they have a different theme each year related to pollinators, and they produce a poster. So I think those, yeah, all of them are awesome and cover different topics. And it is interesting when you start looking at trees and shrubs and trying to figure out what makes sense. There's lots that are good nectar sources, lots are good host plants. I think oak, there's over 500 species of butterflies and moths that will use oak trees. So there's lots of other options. And this is my my PDF version. When I had my PowerPoint version, I also had from Monarch Way Station #1. Yeah, anyway, there's a nice pawpaw tree, and I was excited because I found some nice zebra swallowtails. And then the polyphemus, we had a basswood. Oh, we had some on basswood and some on oak, and they're just the cutest little caterpillars. But so there's lots of options. So I think depending on what you're interested in, there's lots of choices that you could pick that would meet these different needs. And then when you start thinking about trees, there's lots of other factors that come into play. And I think, let me see. Okay, I've got a couple things coming up, a couple more points I wanted to make related to trees, but vines are good as well. And this was just one example. And again, it was from last week when I was out in the garden. So these are pipe vine swallowtail caterpillars, so they'll use pipe vine, Dutchman's pipe, lots of things. So here were 4, if you can see, munching away in a little row. You flip them over, they tend to drop. So one of them dropped, but they're just, there's actually a ton in the garden right now. So there's lots of vines as well. And this was just one example I picked out, mainly because I had a picture of a red-banded hair streak, which is why it's a red-banded hair streak, and not something else. But it's interesting when you start thinking about the entire life cycle, and when you want to provide habitat, what do you do? So when you read this description, what I just pulled from the Missouri Department of Conservation site, so the caterpillars are going to feed on the ground, eating the decaying leaves, right? So again, this idea that you can't clean everything up. I mean, that's it, like another point. You got to think about the life cycle, and a lot of what we do, we clean everything up. We want everything to look nice. So you've got to kind of remember the whole cycle and what that looks like. So fallen leaves aren't necessarily a bad thing, depending on what your goals are. And trees are interesting too, because you do think a lot about what is the amount of cleanup, whether it's fruits or other things that are going to be falling. I think there's lots of things people have preferences for. But there are lots of good options that one can pick. But again, for everything, when you start thinking about the entire life cycle, you got to think it through, and most of it involves being a little messier in life than maybe what people typically do. So. Yeah. And then, it's interesting thinking about the bee lawn perspectives. And it's interesting. So clover would be one. And again, I think everything fits with what someone's goals are, right? But, clover's not going to be native, but it's a good nitrogen fixer and can, address, you might not need to fertilize. And, so you kind of think about what are your goals, what fits best with what you're interested in. And, there are a couple native options as well. And then thinking about approaches, I think most people tend to maybe take the gradual approach of adding more diversity to their lawn over time. But there's lots of information out there, other recommendations, thinking about, trying to get your root systems to grow deeper and need less water, would be not mowing as low, and that might just be a general practice across the board, right? So that you'll have, better development of your root system of the grass as you do have. So there's lots of different options. And I think figuring out what works for you, and maybe something works for you in your backyard better than the front,
I see people taking pictures. This entire presentation is available on the RLI webpage. So just be aware. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem. Yep. But so lots of options. And again, I think a lot of it, depends on, and you've probably heard the saying, is it right? plant, right place. I don't know, right plant, right location, but then I also like to add right person, right? You know, because everything brings its constraints, right? Like, are you okay with, you know, I love passion vine. I'm okay with all the sprouts coming up in lots of different locations, but others may not be, right? So, I mean, I think a lot of it, you know, I feel like for native plants, maybe we don't get enough information about what to expect. So, you know, there's some locations that might be good, you know, but I feel like, you know, a lot of it depends on people. And there was an interesting survey that was published in a paper where they were doing, I think they actually put, I can't think it was Ohio, where they put the survey on people's doors with a $2 bill, so they feel guilty not doing the survey. So that way they did the survey pretty well, apparently. But, you know, they asked about, like, what do you think about these particular native plants? And would you plant them in your yard if we provided the labor and I mean, like, you know, and there were, you know, a lot of resistance. You know, and I think one of them was common milkweed was one of them, and there was not a whole lot of interest in planting common milkweed. You know, even if, you know, the cost was eliminated. But again, you can think about, you know, there may be good locations, not so good locations. You want people to know what they're getting into. If they can plant it in a location, they can mow around it. You know, it's interesting. I feel like maybe we don't have enough information out there to make sure people know what they're getting into so that they will be happy with what they get.
Steve mentioned the K-State forestry program, you know, setting up the bundles and stuff, but do you ever foresee the commercial gardening industry picking up on this, or do they have a conflict of interest with trying to sell you lawn equipment versus something like this? I mean, I would think they would start doing this with the consciousness about, you know, climate change and everything else, but do you see that?
Well, and there are, you know, there are some, you know, I think places that are selling you, you know, because they'll help you convert your lawn and they'll, you know, so they're, but, yeah, the whole lawn industry is interesting, and the history of lawns and, you know, where it all came from is fascinating. But, you know, if people want it, you know, I think there'll be a market for it, but you gotta get interest. And I think, you know, reducing the amount of effort, is important as well.
I don't want to dominate here, but it's, anybody that's driven Kansas highways has seen all kinds of sweet clovers, echinacea, milkweeds and things like that. Does your organization work with state and county or other folks that are actually mowing that stuff or planting that stuff on state property?
In
the past.
And I don't,
Chip worked hard to educate everyone that would listen.
and I don't, so there is a right to way and habitat working group that's working with all the,
Yeah.
like, departments of transportation. I worked with the Oklahoma Department of Transportation. We had some
That's
spots and, but, you know, where they're designating, you know, certain areas, you know, for reduced mowing or planting or whatnot. So there's very big coordinated efforts, to do that, but, you know, they're not getting as broad a participation, right? There's some that aren't participating. And some departments of transportation that show up to all the meetings and they're not on whatever list, but
I mean,
they're working behind the
you see it on
scenes
the
to make it happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they've got a wildflower bundle or that sort of thing that they're planting along with the native grasses. So there's a whole host of programs that they're doing and lawn mixes. A company out of Alma does some of their work for the highway department. And they mix some of that. I don't know where they source their seed. I know some of it's local, but I don't know how it all, so it's a different issue, but.
And I will say, you know, a lot of, I'm thinking of, coming from Oklahoma State and you're driving, you know, when you drive into Stillwater for that football game, how many people want it to look like a lawn versus how many, you know, so it's like who gets the complaints. And so we also need the whole culture to change, right? Like, so instead people are calling in, it was great. I could see the flowers on the road. You know what I mean? It's interesting. Yeah, I feel like there's more we could do to make it easier for them to be able to, you know, not know as much and, you know, have plants where we need them. So yeah, but it's,
And here in Northeast Kansas, I mean, there's a delicate balance between, if you don't mow, it's going to turn into cedars or scrub trees and other things. So you have to manage it somehow.
yeah, yes. And I've got something coming up. It is interesting, and there are a lot of conservation organizations that are anti any chemicals, right? But like at some point, if you don't deal with your Johnson grass, like that's all you're gonna have. You're not gonna have any milkweed. So it's interesting. There's a whole bunch of trade-offs. And then Dina, who works with us at Monarch Watch, she actually did a prescribed fire in her front yard. I should have gone back. At the time when I was originally coming, this was more current, but to get a good picture now. But the whole pocket prairie, people are, converting their entire lawn to a prairie. And once you get there, it's pretty easy, but it does take some effort. So I threw in just some general, let's see how I was doing my time. So some of these points I already made, but the whole resources throughout the growing season is important. And it was interesting with the plant orders for the plant sale. We were talking about, Monarch Watch has the spring plant sale. Some people would order things, it seemed like, multiples of 3 or 4, right? Other people, maybe they had already had an established garden and they were just filling in a few individuals. But usually you want to have a handful of the same kind of plant to provide a good amount of resources, and in particular for those plants, because they can go pretty quickly when you have caterpillars. One thing for monarchs, thinking about the fall migration in particular, or any pollinators that hit the very early spring or the very fall, into the fall activity period, so kind of the extremes, is there's some plants that might be better some years versus other years. So I know, 1 year I would go out and collect a ton of monarchs to tag on sunflower. Now the next year, the migration would be a little bit later. All the sunflower was already past bloom, right? So then it was something different, right? So you want to, make sure you cover and you've got options, because maybe something's not going to be that important because the migration's late this year, but then next year when it's earlier, there'll be something else in bloom. So making sure to have some variability out there. We usually think about native plants requiring less maintenance once established. It depends, of course, on what it is. And perennials, we generally think of them as providing more floral resources than annuals, but there's lots of great annuals out there as well. So again, kind of having that balance in different types of plants available. A lot of times they'll be plant lists, but they'll be very general, so you've probably all seen, asters are good nectar sources. Well, they are, but not all of them. And then the one, some of the cultivars, especially if they're bred for showiness with the double petals, and a lot of times that will mean they'll have lost a lot of the floral resources as a trade-off for that additional showiness. But there's exceptions to that as well. So trying to figure out what works. There'll be a lot of plants that don't attract very many insects, and then a very few that attract a ton. So kind of if you think about the whole kind of native prairie and what that would look like. So, so not everything's going to be great in any particular year, but again, depending on what the year is and the conditions, things might be more or less important. Oh, this is my Johnson grass picture. And this was a site where I used to use it for some of my monarch research. And there's viridis plants out there, you can't see particularly well, but then the John is just increased every year. So again, trying to find a balance between dealing with your long-term and short-term management goals. So, if you need to do something to control the Johnson grass, so you have habitat in the long term, versus meeting your short-term growth goal of reducing chemical use, right? So you kind of have to find that balance of what works. But definitely a challenge. We talked about this some already, but for twig nesting bees, even thinking about, some of our, butterflies and moths that will be overwintering, on site, leaving some of that fall cleanup. Again, not having that pristine garden where you clean everything up. For ground nesting bees, having some access to bare ground. So, maybe you mulch because you want to retain water, but you can leave some areas that aren't mulched, maybe, underneath shrubs or certain areas. So again, trying to find that balance. Variability is good. So not doing the same thing everywhere. Other considerations, thinking about water use. So figuring out ways to reduce water use, which is also hopefully another selling point for native plants, and plants that are good for pollinators, fertilization, yard waste, runoff, all of those things are more and more important, and what we do with our yards and our gardens influence a lot of what that looks like. So adding all of those things into the balance is important. And then to talk about some of Monarch Watch's milkweed programs. So most of our milkweed programs you would apply at the end of the year, early next year. So kind of the planning to plant period. But we have a program for free milkweeds for restoration projects. And so that would, the general requirements, we do 2 acres or more, focused on native habitat restorations and not like landscaping, not large yards, things like that. Having a management plan in place, and then having adding something that's going to either have existing nectar sources or nectar sources that you would add. But we do have a lot of free milkweeds, and again, that's where we'll match the seeds that are grown out, and we grow out the plants versus seeding, because a lot of times the seeding success rate is somewhat low, so that allows it to be more successful. But that program is available, and then we have one that's specific for schools and educational nonprofits, where they can apply for milkweed plants as well.
What would the letter of support look like?
For the schools, I think it's mainly to say we're okay with this going in, and we're not going to like just get rid of it like later in the year. So showing some investment and some commitment, so that it's so that we know there's been conversations and there's support for it.
How do you define a native habitat restoration site? Like, how do you know the difference between a restoration project and landscape?
Well, a lot of times it's location, right? So, if you're in a more rural area, then it would be a little bit, but when it's the natural area, you're not, planting in your lawn per se, or, but, it may be, a natural area that is, more or less part of your
Can you use for something else and then what? Specifically.
Yes, yes.
Where do you find information about that program?
So on our website, we'll have we have a free milkweeds button. We also have the milkweed market. So that would be where we've got nurseries that are growing milkweed. So you can put in your zip code, and then you could like order a flat of milkweed. So I think it's 32 plants in a flat, but so it's kind of a large quantity. So so that could be something too, where maybe you go in with a neighbor if you want to split up, or maybe you're gonna use some at your house and drop some off at the library or or a local school or something. But yeah, so but all of our milkweed programs, we try to match regionally suitable milkweed, and try to have the seeds going back to the location that they came from.
He's got a lot.
Oh, wonderful. It takes some work. And then if you do have a Monarch Way Station habitat that you have not registered yet, And we could use some more way stations in Kansas. I feel like given that this is the home to Monarch Watch, there should be better representation. But we have our way station sign, and this is one view of Monarch Way Station #1. But we always have the spring open house and plant fundraiser. It's usually Mother's Day weekend. And a lot of times that falls on graduation. The fall open house is already scheduled for September 14th. I have never experienced that myself. I think that we give away a bunch of chrysalises so kids can watch them emerge and enjoying the fall migration. But I'm not really sure what else goes on. I will find out on September. Well, I'll know well before then. We're actually talking about maybe having some short presentations to for some of our events. And then we have the fall tagging event that's typically out at Baker Wetland. And I did participate in that last year. So, you know, we have a bunch of tents set up. We have clipboards, and tags, and nets, and we send people out to collect and tag monarchs. It's fun. So, right. So, questions?
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes, very interesting.
Thank you for being very interested.
Okay.
Thank you.
Stop the recording.